It began like any other Thursday. Martin Hayes, 42, an accountant with a quiet life and meticulous routines, left his modest apartment on the east side of the city, briefcase in hand, the faint smell of his morning coffee still lingering on his clothes. The neighborhood was waking up in a familiar rhythm. Dogs barking, distant sirens, the muffled conversations of people on their way to work. Martin's apartment building had always been orderly, nondescript, a place that held comfort in its predictability. Neighbors recalled seeing him step onto the sidewalk, adjusting his tie, offering polite nods to familiar faces. There was nothing extraordinary in his demeanor, nothing that would suggest the day would take a turn that no one could explain. He greeted Mrs. Larkin, the elderly woman who lived below, with a smile that she remembered as warm, familiar, unremarkable in its normalcy. He crossed the street with measured steps, briefcase tapping against his leg, heading toward the barbershop he had frequented for nearly a decade. The barbershop itself was a small, narrow space tucked between a bakery and a laundromat, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. The smell of hair tonic and talcum powder filled the air, mingling with the faint trace of coffee from a corner counter. It was lively for a Thursday morning. Regulars exchanged jokes over the sound of scissors snipping and the low hum of the clippers. The barber, a man named Tony Russo, had known Martin for years. He remembered the routine. Martin would enter, shake hands with Tony, and discuss the usual, stock market movements, office gossip, or his recent fishing trips with his younger brother. Tony described him that morning as cheerful, animated even, laughing at a joke another patron had made about a co-worker's new tie. He had not seemed anxious, distracted, or even hurried. Martin settled into the familiar leather chair by the front window, removing his jacket and placing it neatly beside him. Surveillance footage later would show him shifting slightly, scanning the walls adorned with certificates, photographs of long-time clients, and the occasional old newspaper clipping that Tony had kept for conversation starters. A man in his 40s, clean-shaven, hair a mix of dark brown with the beginnings of gray at the temples, Martin looked entirely ordinary. There was nothing in that moment captured on the grainy security footage that suggested what was about to unfold. He leaned back, hands folded, waiting for the barber to pick up his scissors. The barber worked quickly, expertly, chatting lightly. The background noise of the other clients created an almost soothing atmosphere. For those inside the shop, it was just another morning. And yet, when the appointment concluded, Martin Hayes vanished. There was no commotion, no struggle, no sound that would hint at anything unusual. Tony recalled finishing the haircut and turning around to speak to Martin, only to find the chair empty. The footage confirms that moment as well. Martin had been sitting, shifting slightly, seemingly engaged in conversation, and in the next frame, he was simply gone. There was no footage showing him leaving the shop, no camera capturing him stepping onto the sidewalk, no hint of a car waiting outside. Tony checked the chair, the floor, the surrounding area, thinking perhaps he had stepped into the restroom or briefly gone to speak with another customer. But Martin was nowhere to be found. The initial reaction was confusion. A client may have stepped out to make a phone call, perhaps gone for a quick errand, but the hours passed and he did not return. Other patrons assumed he had returned to his car, parked just a block away. But when his briefcase, wallet, phone, and car keys were found neatly arranged on the counter, untouched, the panic began to take root. Martin's personal effects had never been removed. He had not taken them with him. There was no sign of coercion or disturbance in the shop, no evidence of a struggle. Everything was left exactly as it had been when he sat down, except for the man himself, inexplicably absent. Neighbors and co-workers were contacted almost immediately, trying to account for his whereabouts. No one had seen him leave. No cars were reported driving off suspiciously in the area. The shop's front door had been closed and locked only hours later by another customer. CCTV from surrounding buildings, limited though it was, showed a gap. Martin simply ceases to exist in the public record beyond the threshold of the barbershop. Friends described him as reliable, routine-driven, and entirely predictable. Someone who did not wander aimlessly, someone who would never leave without informing someone close. His disappearance was sudden, silent, and total. By mid-afternoon, his sister Clara had filed the report, growing frantic as she learned that every lead seemed to dissolve into thin air. Police were dispatched to the shop, took statements from Tony, and collected the footage that would later be scrutinized frame by frame. Detectives noted the eerie precision of the disappearance, cataloging the lack of evidence, the untouched personal items, and the complete absence of any witnesses seeing him exit. The shop, once mundane and ordinary, had become the epicenter of a mystery that refused to yield. 6 hours later, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Martin Hayes remained unaccounted for, leaving his family, friends, and neighbors in a state of disbelief. The ordinary morning had ended, but the questions it raised would linger for years to come, the kind of questions that never had satisfying answers, only fragments of possibility that haunted those left behind. By the time noon approached, Martin Hayes had still not returned. Clara, his younger sister by 3 years, felt unease bloom into panic. He had been punctual for work, dependable in every aspect of his life, and always communicated when plans shifted. Calls to his office went unanswered, emails remained unopened, and his phone, normally vibrating with notifications, was silent. Clara's initial unease transformed into alarm when she called the apartment building, only to be told by the superintendent that Martin's apartment door remained closed, lights off, his car parked in its usual spot. Something was wrong. She filed a missing person report with the local police, describing her brother as a man of routine, unlikely to disappear without explanation. The dispatcher noted the concern, but initially categorized it under runaways or temporary absences. When detectives arrived at Martin's apartment, they noted the meticulous orderliness of his home. Clothing neatly folded in drawers, the kitchen clean, bills filed, and no signs of struggle or hasty departure. There was no note, no text message, no evidence that he had planned to leave. His wallet, phone, and keys, all essential to his daily life, were nowhere near him, left instead in the barbershop where he had vanished. The absence of these items added weight to the situation. Investigators immediately expanded their inquiry to the barbershop, speaking with Tony Russo and the few patrons who had been present that morning. Tony repeated the same story. Martin had arrived, chatted, settled into his chair, and then simply disappeared. The patrons confirmed it, their recollections filled with disbelief and unease. Officers began canvassing the surrounding streets, methodically questioning neighbors, passers-by, and anyone who might have seen a man in a gray suit walking alone. The area was busy that morning, yet none could recall noticing Martin exiting the shop. Surveillance from nearby businesses, bakeries, convenience stores, and laundromats was collected and reviewed. Every frame showed the sidewalk, the streets, and the entrances, but Martin Hayes was absent. There was no indication he had moved beyond the barbershop threshold. Some investigators described it to colleagues as the vanishing point, a moment in time where a man had existed one frame and was completely absent the next. The first day passed with a growing tension, the kind of quiet dread that grips families when the ordinary shifts into something unexplainable. Clara spent hours calling every friend, colleague, and neighbor, searching for some rational explanation. Had he left for an early meeting? Was he detained somewhere? Every plausible scenario crumbled under scrutiny. The detectives, meanwhile, widened their search radius, issuing bulletins to patrol officers, checking surveillance along routes Martin might have taken, looking for a car or pedestrian trail. There was none. The possibility of foul play began creeping into conversations, though no suspect had emerged and no witnesses had reported anything unusual beyond the barbershop. As night fell, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on Martin's family. His parents, elderly and frail, sat in the living room, staring at the telephone as if willing it to ring, each moment stretching painfully long. The news of the disappearance began circulating through social media, friends sharing messages and photos, hoping for a lead, an eyewitness, or even a simple confirmation that he had been seen leaving the barbershop. Every tip the police received was followed up meticulously. Officers logged hours of interviews with anyone who might have passed by that morning, cross-referencing locations and timelines. Yet, the trail was frustratingly cold. By the second day, investigators were considering the possibility of an abduction. The public, initially assuming a minor or temporary absence, now began questioning the safety of a neighborhood they had long trusted. Questions emerged. Could someone have entered the shop unnoticed? Was there a vehicle waiting nearby? Had a stranger targeted him, or had the act been opportunistic? None of the evidence pointed conclusively to an answer. Tony Russo recalled the odd stillness in the air, a subtle sense that something had shifted, though he could not articulate why. Patrons who had laughed that morning now recounted their interactions with unease, each recollection tinged with guilt, as though their familiarity had blinded them to danger. The third day brought in more specialized units. Forensic teams examined the barbershop for fingerprints beyond Martin and Tony, looking for anything out of place, anything that might indicate an external presence. They dusted for prints, checked for DNA traces, and analyzed the sequence of events captured by the surveillance cameras. Nothing anomalous appeared, no footprints beyond those expected, no evidence of a struggle, no trace of Martin having left in any conventional manner. Investigators described it as anomalous disappearance, a term that would later define the case. Friends and family oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the hope that he had left for an unexplained reason, while fearing the worst. As hours turned into days, the initial panic matured into an obsessive search. Clara, unwilling to leave any stone unturned, visited every known location Martin frequented: his office, local cafes, the small park where he occasionally walked. She spoke to colleagues and clients, hoping someone had seen him, some fragment of information that might explain the impossible. But no one had. The city seemed to have swallowed him whole. Detectives revisited the neighborhood multiple times, spoke again with the barbershop staff and patrons, and cross-checked all security footage. Each iteration of investigation deepened the mystery. Martin Hayes had vanished in broad daylight from a populated space, leaving behind nothing but personal effects. By the end of the week, the sense of dread had embedded itself in the family's daily rhythm. Each unanswered phone call, each missed message, compounded the fear that had settled like a stone in their stomachs. The ordinary routines of life, work, errands, even simple conversations, were interrupted by the lingering question: where had he gone, and why? The neighborhood, once familiar and safe, now seemed haunted by the memory of that Thursday morning. The search had yielded no answers, only more questions, and a chilling realization that Martin Hayes' disappearance might not have a simple explanation, if any at all. Investigators began retracing Martin Hayes' life with the precision of a meticulous clockmaker. Every detail, no matter how minor, was examined for significance. Colleagues were interviewed first, asked about his routines, habits, and relationships at the office. They described a man who was reliable, polite, and socially consistent, someone who rarely deviated from his carefully maintained schedule. No disputes, no arguments, no unusual behavior. Personal emails were reviewed, chat histories scoured, yet nothing suggested unrest or motive. Investigators found no sign of financial stress, hidden debts, or personal conflicts that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Martin's life, by every measure, seemed ordinary, stable, and unremarkable. A normal man in a normal life, which only deepened the puzzling nature of his absence. Detectives then turned to friends and acquaintances outside work, attempting to uncover any fractures or hidden pressures. They spoke to neighbors, gym buddies, and colleagues from volunteer work. Each narrative was consistent. Martin was pleasant, kind, and methodical, with no known enemies or secret dealings. Investigators even explored the possibility of an estranged relationship or hidden domestic issues, but interviews with Clara and other family members confirmed none existed. The absence of any interpersonal tension left the police without the usual avenues: no motive, no argument, no recent fight to explain a sudden disappearance. Each unremarkable fact became a shadow in the investigation, a sign that this was not a straightforward missing persons case. The barbershop, already a critical point in the timeline, was revisited multiple times. Tony Russo, the barber, cooperated fully, recounting every detail of that morning. He remembered Martin laughing at a joke he had made, talking casually about trying a new hair product he had recently purchased. At the time, Tony had thought nothing of it, an ordinary line of conversation, typical of the friendly banter shared with a regular client. Yet in retrospect, the comment took on a haunting significance. A man discussing a mundane personal choice, only to vanish minutes later, as if the universe had swallowed his existence between the snip of scissors and the sweep of a brush. Investigators cataloged the remark but had no method to transform a trivial conversation into actionable intelligence. Days bled into weeks, and the initial urgency of the search began to taper as leads dwindled. Alerts were issued in local media, photos of Martin distributed online, and social media campaigns encouraged tips from anyone who might have seen him. Police coordinated with surrounding jurisdictions, checking bus routes, train stations, and highways in case Martin had left the city, voluntarily or otherwise. Each inquiry, however, met a wall of silence or inconclusive evidence. CCTV footage from adjacent streets and intersections revealed nothing unusual. Taxi logs, rideshare records, and even casual surveillance of parking garages failed to produce a trace. The absence of any trace beyond the barbershop reinforced the eerie notion that Martin had vanished without leaving a footprint. Tips trickled in from concerned citizens, friends of friends who had seen someone resembling him, or individuals claiming to remember an encounter in a coffee shop or on public transportation. Police followed each one, meticulously verifying alibis, timelines, and locations. None held up. Witness accounts were vague, inconsistent, or contradictory, leading investigators to label many as dead ends. The cumulative effect of this barrage of unfruitful leads wore on the team, eroding initial momentum and creating a sense of futility. Every day, officers returned to the same question. If he hadn't left on his own, who had taken him? And why was there no trace? The detectives also explored forensic avenues, examining the barbershop and surrounding areas for overlooked physical evidence. Dusting for fingerprints revealed only Martin's and Tony's, with no trace of a stranger's presence. DNA swabs, though largely routine, produced nothing unusual. Searches of Martin's apartment and personal effects yielded no hidden documents, letters, or messages. Even his financial records, credit card statements, and online activity were normal, reflecting a life lived in ordinary patterns. The case was steadily becoming what law enforcement would later term anomalous, a disappearance defying the usual logic of abductions, runaways, or accidents. Family involvement intensified as weeks stretched into months. Clara, refusing to accept the possibility that her brother had vanished without a trace, became a fixture at the barbershop, retracing his movements repeatedly. She scoured parks, subway stations, and every street Martin had walked. Friends and extended family joined the search, distributing flyers, canvassing neighborhoods, and contacting local news outlets to keep his face in the public eye. Despite their tireless efforts, each avenue of investigation led to the same blank wall of uncertainty. Conversations about Martin's character, habits, and interests only underscored his stability, leaving investigators and loved ones with a haunting question. How does a man with no apparent risk factors disappear so completely? Police meetings grew tense as frustration mounted. Detectives reviewed their methods, double-checked alibis, and re-interviewed witnesses, yet no pattern emerged. The case log, once full of leads and speculative theories, was slowly reduced to a chronological map of nothingness. Martin Hayes had entered the barbershop and never left, at least not in any detectable form. Even ordinary explanations such as misadventure, accidental injury, or medical emergency were weakened by the absence of evidence in nearby streets, parks, or alleys. The physical and digital trail had evaporated entirely, leaving the investigation stranded at a liminal edge between hope and despair. By the end of the first month, the case had reached a plateau of coldness. Investigators, though still active, recognized the limits of conventional inquiry. The unusual circumstances surrounding Martin's disappearance began to dominate internal reports and memos. The undisturbed apartment, untouched personal items, absence of struggle, and the inability to locate him in any footage or witness account. Each dead end became another ghost in the narrative, a haunting confirmation that the case was neither ordinary nor resolvable by standard procedures. The small hair product remark, trivial at the moment, lingered like a whispered premonition. Investigators and family alike were left suspended, staring into a silence that offered no answers, only the persistent, unsettling awareness that Martin Hayes was gone, and the world had no explanation for it. When Martin Hayes failed to return home, local news stations quickly sensed a story that was both unusual and deeply unsettling. Reports emphasized the peculiar details: a man who had simply vanished from a familiar neighborhood barbershop, leaving behind his wallet, phone, and car keys, as if he had stepped into another reality. Anchors described the scene with a mixture of curiosity and caution, noting the lack of evidence and the swift involvement of police. Viewers across the town tuned in with a sense of disbelief, some incredulous, others disturbed, as the narrative diverged from typical missing person reports. Within hours, the story had traveled through local networks, each segment amplifying the sense of mystery and urgency. The media coverage transformed the disappearance from a private family tragedy into a community-wide phenomenon, drawing attention from individuals who had never met Martin but felt connected to the bizarre circumstances of his absence. Residents of the town reacted with a mix of fear and fascination. Online forums filled with speculation, theories ranging from the plausible to the extreme, all dissected every known detail of Martin's last day. Comments debated whether it was a calculated disappearance, a medical emergency gone unnoticed, or something darker. Some suggested foul play, imagining an opportunistic abductor waiting outside the barbershop. Others speculated on more extraordinary explanations, ideas that the police considered improbable but could not fully dismiss due to the lack of evidence. Call-in radio shows invited listeners to share their interpretations, further fueling public curiosity. Each discussion reflected the growing anxiety of a town suddenly faced with an event that violated their sense of safety and order, turning familiar streets into spaces of unease. The barbershop itself became an inadvertent focal point. Regulars continued their routines, but with a palpable tension, speaking in hushed tones about Martin's disappearance. Some avoided the conversation entirely, wary of confronting the reality that a neighbor could vanish in broad daylight without warning. Others became fixated, tracing the steps Martin had taken that morning, speculating about what might have occurred between the snip of scissors and the moment he failed to exit into the street. Hair clippings, once mundane remnants of routine, were now transformed into eerie symbols, almost talismanic in the minds of those who witnessed them. The chair Martin had occupied was cleaned and maintained, yet the air around it seemed charged with the unresolved questions of an ordinary day that had spiraled into uncertainty. Media segments began to incorporate psychological perspectives, interviewing experts on the trauma caused by unresolved disappearances. Psychologists explained that when a loved one vanishes without explanation, family members often experience prolonged grief, compounded by obsessive thought patterns and feelings of helplessness. They described the emotional toll on Clara and Martin's parents, whose daily lives had been overtaken by worry and ritualized searches. Interviews with family members revealed the slow, grinding pain of uncertainty, the frustration of waiting for leads that never materialized, and the relentless questioning of what might have gone wrong. Public empathy for the family grew, and coverage emphasized both the mystery and the human cost, making the audience keenly aware that Martin's absence was more than a news story. It was a living tragedy for those closest to him. As local attention intensified, volunteers joined search parties, distributing flyers, revisiting streets, parks, and parking lots, often retracing the same routes repeatedly. Each new face added both support and a subtle layer of pressure, the community's concern heightening the emotional stakes. Social media campaigns encouraged residents to share Martin's photo, hoping someone might have noticed a clue overlooked by official investigations. Yet every lead, every reported sighting, either failed verification or dissolved into speculation. The process became a repetitive cycle of hope and disappointment, keeping the family and the public suspended in an ongoing state of anticipation and anxiety. Local journalists investigated Martin's life beyond the barbershop, speaking to colleagues, friends, and neighbors to provide a broader narrative context. They highlighted his routine existence, a man dedicated to his work, involved in his community, with no history of conflict or trouble. This framing reinforced the strangeness of the disappearance. If someone so ordinary could vanish in such an inexplicable way, what did that imply about safety and predictability in the town? These reflections resonated with viewers, who projected their own fears and uncertainties onto the case. The community's collective imagination transformed Martin's absence into a mirror for hidden vulnerabilities, turning an individual tragedy into a town-wide contemplation of fragility and unpredictability. Despite the growing coverage, the story maintained an unresolved edge. Updates were scarce, with each media outlet reporting on ongoing searches, police statements, and public concern without offering definitive explanations. The lack of answers kept the narrative alive, encouraging continuous engagement from viewers who tracked every development and engaged with every speculative angle. Public fascination blended with genuine empathy, creating a climate in which hope and despair were equally present. The media's attention amplified the emotional gravity, highlighting both the mystery and the enduring impact on the family. Through all the coverage, Clara remained a constant presence, her voice representing the human face behind the headlines. She appeared in interviews, described her relentless efforts to find her brother, and shared the psychological weight of living in limbo. Her persistence humanized the story, providing an emotional anchor for the audience amidst the swirl of speculation and media noise. Her grief was raw, her hope enduring, and her commitment unwavering, a stark reminder that behind every story of disappearance was a network of people grappling with fear, uncertainty, and profound loss. By the time the media spotlight began to settle into a steady pattern, the town had absorbed Martin's disappearance into its collective consciousness. The case remained a conversation starter in coffee shops, on radio shows, and within families, each retelling a mix of curiosity and caution. The unresolved nature of the disappearance created a lingering tension, a quiet acknowledgement that the ordinary morning when Martin Hayes walked into a barbershop had forever changed the town's perception of reality and security. Residents and family members alike were left with a persistent, unanswerable question: how does a man disappear so completely, leaving behind only fragments of routine and no explanation for what became of him? That question would persist, haunting the narrative, as investigators and the community alike continued to seek answers in a mystery that refused to close. 6 years had passed since Martin Hayes vanished from the small neighborhood barbershop, years marked by unanswered questions and a quiet resignation in the community. The case had faded from daily headlines, lingering mostly in the memories of family, friends, and those who had been present the morning he disappeared. The shop itself had continued its routine. The familiar snip of scissors, the hum of conversation, the smell of hair tonic, all the ordinary markers of daily life persisted. Yet, for the man who had cut Martin's hair that day, something unusual began to punctuate the ordinary. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. The barber, still running the shop, noticed small clumps of hair collecting in the drain of his main sink. At first, he dismissed it as a natural result of trimming clients' hair, routine maintenance that he had performed countless times before. The hairs seemed insignificant, easily swept away with a brush or washed down during cleanup at the end of the day. But over several weeks, the accumulation became more pronounced, appearing consistently after certain appointments. The repetition was unnerving. There was an order to it, a pattern that refused to be ignored. The barber began to catalog the dates, the time of day, and even the type of haircut that preceded each new discovery, noting that these small clumps always appeared after the same customer had left, even months later. As he examined the hair more closely, an unsettling possibility formed in his mind. The strands were finer than typical adult hair, with subtle characteristics that reminded him of Martin's unique hair texture. He hesitated to voice his suspicion, wary of appearing irrational after so many years had passed, but the coincidence gnawed at him, pulling him into a state of quiet dread. He could no longer rationalize the phenomenon as normal shedding or leftover debris. Each new clump of hair felt like a message, a remnant of a person whose absence had remained unexplained for 6 years. Clara Hayes, Martin's sister, was contacted with cautious urgency. She had not anticipated revisiting the cold case, yet the barber's insistence and the peculiar recurrence of hair compelled her to act. A private DNA test was commissioned, the strands carefully collected and sent to a forensic laboratory. Days passed in anxious waiting, the weight of years of unanswered questions pressing heavily on Clara and her family. When the results arrived, the confirmation was devastating in its precision. The hair matched Martin's DNA. The shock reverberated through every aspect of their lives, reigniting grief that had never fully subsided. It was a tangible, inexplicable connection to Martin, emerging 6 years after his disappearance, as if the world had shifted to make his absence suddenly present once more. News of the discovery spread cautiously at first, shared only with law enforcement and immediate family. Detectives revisited old case files, combing through reports and surveillance footage, searching for any detail that might connect the hair to a larger narrative. Forensic experts were called to analyze the barbershop's plumbing system, considering the highly unusual circumstances of the discovery. Could hair have persisted through years of water flow, cleaning chemicals, and routine usage? Was it possible that someone had returned secretly to plant it, a final cruel message to the family? Each scenario was examined and discarded in turn, yet none provided a satisfying explanation. The evidence was both concrete and incomprehensible, straddling the boundary between reality and enigma. The barber's own emotional state became increasingly fragile. He described nights of restlessness, haunted by a sense of guilt and fear he could not name. Had he unknowingly facilitated something sinister on the day Martin disappeared? The recurring presence of hair in his sink created a psychological echo, a reminder of the unresolved tragedy that had defined so much of his life. He began to clean obsessively, checking drains multiple times a day, yet the pattern continued, undeterred by his vigilance. The once comforting routines of his profession now carried an undercurrent of dread. Each snip of scissors, each conversation with a customer was tinged with anxiety, the past intruding on the present with relentless persistence. Investigators approached the situation with measured caution, balancing the need for scientific analysis with the recognition that human perception could distort reality over time. The hairs were carefully removed and cataloged, examined under microscopes, and compared with forensic databases. Plumbing systems were scrutinized, water flow patterns analyzed, and environmental factors considered. Yet the findings consistently defied conventional explanation. The presence of Martin's hair, in clumps appearing at regular intervals years after his disappearance, was both undeniable and baffling. The case was officially reopened, but rather than providing clarity, the new evidence deepened the mystery. For Clara, the discovery was a paradoxical mix of relief and renewed anguish. The connection to Martin, once abstract and distant, was now literal and tangible. Yet the presence of his hair, unaccompanied by any other trace or explanation, underscored the unresolved nature of his disappearance. She returned to the barbershop, standing silently near the sink, confronting the reality that her brother's absence had evolved into a new form of presence, one that could be measured in strands of hair but not in answers. Her grief, previously measured in years of waiting and unanswered questions, now included the bewildering weight of evidence that provided confirmation without context. The town learned of the discovery slowly, through careful media statements and discreet reports. Public fascination returned, this time tinged with disbelief at the implausibility of the scenario. Discussions resurfaced about the strange persistence of clues, the eerie capacity for ordinary locations to harbor extraordinary mysteries, and the enduring human desire for closure. The barber's role, once peripheral, was now central, his ordinary profession intersecting with an event that defied logic, leaving both him and the community with a persistent unease. In the midst of renewed investigation, the hair in the drain remained, a chilling, silent testament to the ongoing puzzle of Martin Hayes. It was a detail at once intimate and incomprehensible, a fragment of a life that had vanished yet refused to be forgotten. As forensic teams, family members, and law enforcement wrestled with this new development, one truth became unavoidable. The disappearance had entered a new, darker phase, where the boundary between evidence and enigma had collapsed, leaving the Hayes family once again suspended in the unrelenting weight of unanswered questions, hoping for a resolution that might never arrive. The renewed investigation brought detectives back to the barbershop, a place that had once been ordinary, now transformed into a locus of mystery. The familiar scent of hair tonic and disinfectant had not changed, but every corner, every countertop seemed imbued with new significance. Investigators moved methodically, examining areas that had been previously overlooked, tracing plumbing schematics, and inspecting drains with a level of scrutiny not seen during the original inquiry. Their work was slow, meticulous, and painstaking, as though each detail, no matter how small, might reveal a thread leading to Martin Hayes. The basement of the shop, a cramped and dimly lit space where cleaning supplies were stored and old equipment stacked, became a focus of intense attention. Detectives noted oddities in the drainage pipes, unusual bends and loops that could, theoretically, trap debris for extended periods. Hair was discovered in unexpected locations, small tufts that seemed to have no logical explanation for their presence or timing. These accumulations could not be accounted for by ordinary shedding or residual debris from 6 years prior. Each discovery deepened the sense of unease among the team, blurring the line between routine forensics and the inexplicable. Detectives interviewed current and former employees, hoping that memory might reveal overlooked details. Longtime customers were also approached, their recollections scrutinized for inconsistencies or hidden significance. Most recollections were ordinary, mundane snippets about hairstyles, casual conversations, and fleeting observations from the mornings they visited. Yet a few recollections took on a new weight in light of the recent hair discoveries. A comment about a drain behaving oddly, a fleeting impression of a strange odor, a vague memory of a door that seemed locked differently than usual. Individually, these were insignificant, but collectively, they suggested a pattern, a series of small, otherwise unnoticed phenomena that might now be connected to Martin's disappearance. Clara Hayes accompanied detectives, moving quietly through the shop, absorbing the renewed attention with a mixture of grief and resolve. Her eyes were drawn repeatedly to the sink where hair had been discovered, the focal point of renewed speculation. She confronted the barber, the man who had been present the morning Martin disappeared, about the evidence. His response was defensive, yet the fear underlying his posture was unmistakable. He insisted he did not understand how the hair could have appeared, claiming the drains had been checked repeatedly over the years. His voice wavered, the certainty of his long routine shaken by the tangible evidence before him. Clara felt both frustration and empathy, anger at the unanswered questions, yet recognition of the shared bewilderment and unease. Investigators documented each inch of the shop with methodical precision. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, and every accessible cavity examined for hidden compartments or unusual crevices. The patterns of hair accumulation were mapped against water flow schematics, yet no logical explanation emerged. Forensic teams tested for environmental anomalies, bacterial growth, and potential contamination, seeking to determine whether the hair could have persisted through chemical reactions or unexpected physical retention. The results were inconclusive, reinforcing the strangeness of the findings and leaving the case poised at the intersection of mystery and forensic reality. Neighbors and passers-by were questioned, particularly those who had overlooked the barbershop as a simple, unremarkable part of daily life. Occasionally, subtle details emerged. Someone remembered seeing a door open briefly when it should have been closed. Another recalled hearing faint noises late in the evening years ago. These recollections, while fragmentary, were catalogued and cross-referenced with prior statements, yet nothing conclusively connected to Martin's whereabouts. The detectives' frustration grew alongside their determination. Each dead end reinforced the gravity of the unknown and the sense that the case was far from closed. As the investigation pressed on, the question hanging over the shop became impossible to ignore. Hair continued to appear in impossible places, yet no human activity could account for its timing or distribution. The anomalies in the drainage and basement systems remained unexplained, leaving an eerie impression of forces or actions beyond comprehension. Every finding, every measured observation seemed to deepen the gap between what was known and what was possible. The barbershop, a site of ordinary routines, had become a focal point of uncertainty, a place where ordinary life and unresolved disappearance converged. Clara, watching as experts analyzed the sink and plumbing, grappled with the chilling implications. The discoveries suggested that Martin's presence, or at least a trace of him, persisted in the space, yet the reality of whether he was alive, deceased, or whether someone else was sending a message remained impossible to determine. The hair, tangible yet unexplained, became a symbol of enduring uncertainty, a silent witness to events that defied logical explanation. Each strand held the weight of years of unanswered questions, connecting the past to a present fraught with tension and fear. The barber, now under scrutiny not just by authorities but by the enduring gaze of Martin's family, began to show signs of strain. Routine actions, washing hands, cleaning counters, emptying trash, became fraught with anxiety. His defensiveness coexisted with fear, a complex response to the undeniable evidence now confronting him. Every visit to the shop, every interaction with the space where Martin had vanished, was overlaid with a sense of inescapable scrutiny, both external and internal. By the end of the day, the shop, once an ordinary backdrop to neighborhood life, had been transformed in the collective consciousness of the investigators and family alike. Each detail examined, each strange anomaly catalogued, had drawn the case further into the realm of unresolved tension. The hair, the drains, the basements, the memories, and the observations all coalesced into a question that could not yet be answered. Was Martin Hayes alive, deceased, or had some unknown presence manipulated events to leave a message that had persisted across years? The barbershop, still humming with the routines of daily life, now stood as a silent witness to a mystery that continued to defy understanding, leaving everyone involved suspended in the uneasy weight of what might never be explained. As the barbershop investigation continued to reveal inexplicable anomalies, attention turned toward understanding the human element of the mystery. Forensic psychologists were brought in, tasked with evaluating both Martin Hayes' personality and the potential actions of anyone who might have had a hand in his disappearance. They examined the details of his life, routine habits, relationships, personal stresses, but found nothing overtly unusual. Friends described him as meticulous, reliable, and calm, yet capable of quiet humor and occasional impulsive decisions. These contrasting traits provided fertile ground for analysis, prompting professionals to explore a spectrum of possibilities. Had Martin left voluntarily, or was he the victim of a calculated act? Experts began considering the concept of self-staged disappearances. It was an uncomfortable hypothesis, yet one that could not be ignored. They assessed his financials, social interactions, and personal communications for signs of planning. The meticulous records in his bank accounts offered no clue of large withdrawals, transfers, or preparations for extended travel. His digital footprint was equally ordinary, with routine social media activity, emails, and texts following predictable patterns up to the day he vanished. The absence of evidence for planning suggested either that he had left without leaving a trace, a feat difficult to imagine, or that someone else had intervened entirely. Abduction was the next scenario psychologists examined. Could Martin have been taken, and if so, why would traces of him, the hair discovered years later, appear intermittently in a place as mundane as a barbershop? Investigators and experts debated whether the hair was a message, a misdirection, or a remnant of a larger plan. Questions about motive, opportunity, and method emerged. Did someone close to Martin orchestrate his disappearance, or had a stranger exploited circumstances? Each possibility seemed both plausible and implausible, feeding the sense of unease that had grown around the case over 6 long years. The emergence of unexplained evidence, hair in drains, anomalies in the plumbing, strange recurring patterns, invited darker possibilities. Psychologists introduced theories that bordered on obsession or ritual. Could Martin have been held in secret captivity, controlled by a captor who left intentional signs to haunt those searching for him? Alternatively, could the situation indicate ritualistic behavior, a series of deliberate acts meant to instill fear or communicate a cryptic message? These ideas were not presented lightly. Each was grounded in behavioral research and case studies from unresolved disappearances, yet their implications were deeply unsettling. The blend of possibility and uncertainty intensified the psychological weight for everyone involved, particularly his family. Clara Hayes, already grappling with grief, became increasingly consumed by these theories. Her days were dominated by research, tracking updates on similar cases, reading expert analyses, and trying to reconcile each new possibility with the life she had shared with Martin. Nights brought little reprieve. Sleep was disrupted by restless questioning, vivid dreams, and the persistent replaying of minor details. The joke Martin had made at the barber's, the way he left the shop that morning, the absence of any definitive closure. Each fragment of memory and each emerging theory seemed simultaneously insignificant and crucial, layering her mind with anxiety and doubt. The psychologists emphasized the emotional phenomenon known as ambiguous loss. They explained how cases in which closure is impossible, where the fate of a loved one remains unknown, create a unique form of trauma. Traditional grieving could not proceed because certainty was absent. One cannot fully mourn what is neither confirmed dead nor alive. Clara's emotional strain mirrored this description. She was trapped in the liminal space between hope and despair, her mind continually oscillating between imagined scenarios of reunion and imagined horrors of harm. Friends noted her distracted demeanor, the hollow expression behind her determined effort to remain functional, and the frequent moments of silence where she seemed lost in thought. As the forensic psychologists presented their findings in interviews and reports, public fascination intensified. Media outlets amplified the complexity of the theories, discussing the ambiguity, the persistence of hair evidence, and the inexplicable nature of the barbershop anomalies. Panel discussions debated psychological profiles, abduction motives, and the plausibility of voluntary disappearance. Forums and social media threads churned with speculation. Each new conversation added to the collective tension, with ordinary residents of the town imagining the unimaginable. Their curiosity mingled with unease. For Clara, the relentless speculation compounded her personal anguish. The range of theories, from self-staging to captivity, from ritualistic intent to obsessive behavior, offered no resolution, only a spectrum of possibilities, each carrying its own potential horror. Her days became a careful navigation between external appearances of composure and internal battles with intrusive thoughts. Even routine interactions, grocery runs, phone calls, neighborhood errands, were shadowed by the cognitive load of unanswerable questions. The unknown fate of Martin became a persistent, unyielding presence in her consciousness, a psychological weight that shaped her every decision and reaction. Investigators recognized that the psychological dimension of the case was as significant as the physical evidence. The hair in the drains, the plumbing anomalies, and the barbershop's hidden corners were now contextualized not only as forensic curiosities, but as elements with emotional and cognitive impact. Experts explained that unresolved mysteries of this kind often manifest in obsessional thinking, hypervigilance, and repeated attempts to find meaning in inconclusive evidence. Clara exemplified this dynamic, her meticulous tracking of reports and expert commentary, both a coping mechanism and a reflection of the enduring human need for closure. By the conclusion of this phase of the investigation, the case had evolved into a complex interplay of evidence and interpretation, fact and theory, physical trace and psychological consequence. Each theory proposed by forensic psychologists, each possible scenario of disappearance, captivity, or voluntary departure, added a new layer to the narrative. The haunting questions persisted. Was Martin alive, trapped, orchestrating his own absence, or had something more sinister occurred? The ambiguity endured, deepening the emotional resonance of the case and ensuring that the mystery surrounding Martin Hayes would remain unresolved, lingering in the minds of those who continued to search for answers. The case that had lingered for 6 years without resolution suddenly shifted when a former apprentice of the barbershop came forward. He described a man who had frequented the shop in the weeks before Martin Hayes vanished, someone whose presence had seemed unremarkable at the time, but, in retrospect, was marked by subtle strangeness. The apprentice recalled the man's meticulous attention to the layout of the chairs, the sinks, and even the placement of personal items behind the counter. He remembered how the stranger would linger near the plumbing, sometimes asking questions about the pipes or the drains in a way that had once seemed casual, but now struck a chilling note. Investigators immediately noted the significance. The description matched no known patrons and did not correlate with any regular employees. It raised a question that had not been asked before. Had someone exploited the barbershop itself to conceal evidence, or had they been preparing for something far more sinister? Detectives revisited every record of visitors during the period surrounding Martin's disappearance. Surveillance footage, sparse and grainy from the mid-2010s, was reviewed frame by frame. Witness statements were re-examined, each recollection compared against the details provided by the apprentice. Patterns emerged, minor inconsistencies, fleeting appearances of individuals whose presence had been dismissed at the time, and subtle behavioral anomalies. Each piece seemed trivial on its own, but, when combined, suggested a deliberate focus on the barbershop's environment. Investigators were cautious, aware that memory could be unreliable, yet the convergence of these recollections created a sense of urgency. There was someone who had been in the shop with a purpose that no one had previously understood. Plumbing contractors, brought in to examine the shop in meticulous detail, uncovered structural modifications dating back several years. Sections of the floorboards had been replaced, access panels installed, and cavities created in the walls and beneath the sinks. These hidden spaces, though not originally designed for concealment, were capable of accumulating hair, organic debris, or other small materials over extended periods without detection. The discovery provided a plausible explanation for the periodic reappearance of Martin's hair, which had baffled investigators for years. Yet even with this knowledge, questions remained. Had the hair been introduced deliberately as a psychological message, or had it genuinely persisted through modifications concealed by the structural peculiarities of the shop? Forensic analysts faced a daunting task, determining whether the hair in the drain was recent or long-standing. Advanced testing examined DNA integrity, exposure to moisture, and potential contamination. Initial results were ambiguous. While certain degradation markers suggested aging, others implied recent placement. Forensic experts were careful in their conclusions, noting that environmental conditions, including variations in water exposure and temperature, could skew indicators. The possibility that someone had tampered with the drains years later could not be excluded. This uncertainty intensified the tension surrounding the case. What seemed like a breakthrough simultaneously deepened the mystery. As the investigators pieced together these new threads, they began to map the stranger's potential connections to Martin's disappearance. Employment records, public activity, and known acquaintances were scrutinized for overlap with the timelines of the hair appearances and the barbershop modifications. While no definitive link was immediately established, circumstantial patterns hinted at a disturbing possibility. Someone had observed the shop, the employees, and Martin himself with a level of focus that went beyond mere coincidence. The scenario suggested premeditation, yet there remained no proof that Martin had been physically harmed by this visitor. Each lead offered both hope and apprehension, the balance shifting as new details emerged. Meanwhile, Clara Hayes, long haunted by uncertainty, learned of the apprentice's testimony. Her initial reaction was a complex mixture of relief and fear. The idea that there could finally be a tangible lead offered a fragile sense of possibility, yet the implications of an unknown individual manipulating the environment for years rekindled nightmares she had struggled to suppress. She began compiling her own notes, cross-referencing timelines, and revisiting prior reports of anomalies in the shop. The combination of official investigation and Clara's personal diligence created a renewed momentum that reinvigorated the long-stalled case. Media coverage amplified the development. News outlets framed the story around the return of hope and the emergence of hidden complexities. Programs exploring cold cases highlighted the unusual aspects of the barbershop itself, the structural modifications, and the recurring hair evidence. Psychologists commented on the psychological impact of prolonged, unresolved disappearances, noting that families often experience renewed trauma alongside renewed hope when fresh leads surface. Online forums debated the plausibility of the stranger's involvement, speculating on motives ranging from obsession to revenge, and from random targeting to carefully orchestrated malice. The narrative captured public attention anew, balancing fascination with apprehension. Despite this progress, the investigation remained confounding. The evidence was compelling yet incomplete, suggesting someone's calculated activity while simultaneously leaving gaps that defied easy explanation. Forensic, structural, and testimonial data converged to paint a portrait of a disappearance that was far from straightforward. Hair that might have persisted for years, hidden cavities in modified plumbing, and the recollection of a stranger with obscure intentions all contributed to a sense of uncertainty that marred the early days of the case. Every answer seemed to generate further questions. By the close of this phase, detectives were left with a cautious optimism tempered by the realization that the situation had grown more complex. There were leads that could be pursued, connections to be verified, and behavioral patterns to interpret, yet no definitive conclusion had been reached. Martin's fate remained unknown. The barbershop continued to hold its secrets, and the mysterious visitor's role lingered as a haunting presence over the investigation. Each element, structural evidence, eyewitness testimony, and forensic ambiguity, wove together into a narrative that was both tantalizingly close to resolution and as perplexing as ever, ensuring that the story of Martin Hayes remained a mystery that gripped all who followed it. Months of careful forensic testing culminated in a report that sent tremors through everyone following the case. Laboratory analysts confirmed what had been suspected, yet remained almost impossible to believe. The hair recovered from the barbershop's drain was unquestionably Martin Hayes. DNA matched perfectly, with no anomalies or signs of tampering. Contamination had been ruled out. Each strand told the same story, consistent with genetic material directly from Martin, yet no other evidence placed him in the shop since his disappearance. The confirmation forced investigators, Clara Hayes, and even the barber himself to confront a reality that defied common understanding. How could this be happening? How could hair, a biological remnant typically discarded or washed away, return consistently over the course of years without the individual being present? Police officers meticulously documented every inch of the barbershop, noting every drain, cavity, and hidden compartment. Plumbing experts were called in again to examine whether environmental factors could somehow preserve hair or facilitate its movement through unnoticed channels. All conventional explanations failed. Water flow, suction, and drainage patterns could not account for the placement or quantity of hair. Every hypothesis seemed insufficient. Investigators found themselves in a landscape where science and mystery collided, each detail grounded in fact, yet resisting coherent interpretation. Even the most experienced detectives admitted this case tested the boundaries of their professional experience, as the evidence challenged not only expectations, but the basic logic of the situation. Clara Hayes, already accustomed to living in limbo, was drawn deeper into the investigation. Sleepless nights became routine as she cataloged reports, photographs, and forensic notes. She pored over each laboratory finding, trying to construct a rational explanation that could account for what seemed impossible. Yet each analysis, each observation, only reinforced the unsettling conclusion. The hair was Martin's, and it had been appearing in the shop long after his disappearance. The recurring evidence transformed the barbershop into more than just a location of routine haircuts. It had become a focal point of anxiety, grief, and unanswered questions. A place that seemed to reach into the past and pull fragments of Martin's presence into the present. Public fascination intensified. Forums dedicated to unresolved mysteries and paranormal speculation began circulating theories. Some users suggested preternatural activity, claiming the hair's persistence was proof of forces beyond comprehension. Others imagined psychological manipulations, elaborate schemes by an unknown observer designed to torment the family. Despite these narratives, professionals in the field emphasized grounded explanations. Forensic psychologists discussed the emotional phenomenon of ambiguous evidence, where the mind struggles to reconcile physical proof with an absent subject. Investigators maintained their focus on measurable factors: plumbing, environmental preservation, and human behavior. No one dismissed the hair, but explanations remained provisional, careful to avoid jumping to conclusions in a case that already defied conventional logic. The barber, who had managed the shop for decades, found himself haunted in ways he could not articulate. He spoke cautiously to reporters and law enforcement, expressing disbelief that he could have missed a rational explanation. He was defensive, yet visibly unsettled, aware that the hair's return reflected on his workspace, and, in his mind, perhaps on his own actions or negligence. Employees, both past and present, noted the eerie weight that seemed to hang over the shop. Regulars whispered in corners, recounting past visits when things had felt off, but had been dismissed as imagination. The barbershop had transformed from a place of everyday routine into a space marked by unease, tension, and the lingering presence of unresolved mystery. Clara's personal pursuit of answers continued in tandem with official investigation. She interviewed former patrons, revisited prior records, and retraced every step Martin had taken in the days leading up to his disappearance. Yet each new inquiry brought more questions than answers. While she hoped to discover rational explanations, an overlooked visitor, structural peculiarity, or someone manipulating the environment, none emerged definitively. Each dead end reinforced the cruel ambiguity of the situation, leaving her trapped in a cycle of grief, hope, and frustration. Her relationship with closure had fractured entirely. The evidence demanded acknowledgement of Martin's existence in the present, even as his physical absence remained absolute. Police and forensic teams expanded their documentation, aware that every observation might become crucial if new leads appeared. High-resolution photography, chemical analysis of water residues, and microscopic examination of hair follicles became standard protocol. The case assumed the status of a controlled study in persistent mystery, a collection of physical evidence whose implications resisted explanation. Detectives emphasized diligence, understanding that even in the absence of immediate answers, meticulous records could preserve the potential for future breakthroughs. Each fiber of hair became a tangible record, a trace that tied the impossible to the physical world, forcing the investigation to remain active and methodical despite its haunting nature. Discussions among experts highlighted the psychological toll this type of evidence could exert. Forensic psychologists explained that families encountering inexplicable remnants of a missing person often experience intensified trauma. The presence of Martin's hair acted as a constant reminder, preventing mental closure and perpetuating a state of suspended grief. Observers noted that ambiguous evidence, particularly when recurring, amplifies obsessive thought patterns, drives compulsive investigative behaviors, and complicates rational decision-making. Clara, like many others, experienced the weight of these insights firsthand, navigating the blurred line between hope for discovery and despair at enduring uncertainty. By the conclusion of this phase, the barbershop remained a locus of tension. The hair continued to defy explanation, forensics confirmed its authenticity, and every conventional hypothesis had been exhausted. Public fascination, professional inquiry, and personal obsession converged in a space where the impossible seemed to have left a trace. Martin Hayes remained missing, yet his presence, through the hair, continued to assert itself in ways both subtle and undeniable. Every shred of evidence recorded, every microscopic detail catalogued, ensured that this case would endure as one of the most confounding and haunting cold cases in recent memory. Years of investigation culminated without resolution. Every lead, every analysis, and every interview produced fragments of information, but no definitive answer emerged. Martin Hayes' disappearance remained a question mark etched into the fabric of the barbershop, the neighborhood, and his family's life. Forensic reports confirmed the hair repeatedly appearing in the drains was his, yet how it arrived there remained inexplicable. Conventional theories, abduction, voluntary disappearance, hidden captivity, fell short, unable to account for the persistent traces of his existence. The police closed the file officially, marking the case as unsolved, yet the case never truly ended for those who had lived it. The barber, once the center of casual scrutiny and friendly conversation, resigned quietly. He left the shop under a cloud of lingering guilt and pervasive fear, haunted by the knowledge that he had been unable to provide answers and that something inexplicable had unfolded in the very space he had managed for decades. Former employees remembered the subtle shifts in his demeanor in the months before his departure, a mix of obsession, unease, and the weight of being connected to a mystery that refused explanation. Clara Hayes refused to accept closure in the absence of truth. She continued visiting the shop, leaving letters, notes, and photographs by the drain where the hair had repeatedly appeared. Each gesture was an attempt to communicate, to leave a trace for Martin if he could somehow respond, to assert hope against a reality dominated by uncertainty. Friends and neighbors witnessed her obsession, the quiet persistence of someone unwilling to surrender to ambiguity. New tips surfaced sporadically, sometimes hinting at forgotten acquaintances or overlooked details, but none led to concrete answers. The barbershop retained its quiet unease, a normal space transformed into a site of ongoing tension. 6 years after that routine visit, Martin's presence, fragmented in hair, continued to whisper through the drains, leaving an open-ended question. How does one vanish, yet leave pieces of themselves behind, haunting those left searching?